On the 1st of July, Atiku Abubakar's name was formally uploaded to Nigeria's INEC portal as a presidential candidate for 2027. On paper, that should have been a moment of strength, the culmination of a coalition he helped build, a primary he won, a ticket now officially in motion. But 11 days earlier, a rival faction inside his own party stood up and said his candidacy doesn't exist. And 6 weeks before that, the most consequential northern political operator outside Atiku's own camp, a man who once stood beside him in that same coalition, walked away and took a movement with him. So here is the question nobody in the headlines is asking properly. If Atiku now holds the official paperwork but doesn't hold the North the way he once did, which one actually decides who becomes president in 2027? The document or the base? Before we go any further, if you are new to this channel, welcome. Naija Insight Desk exists for one reason, to give you the kind of analysis that goes beyond the headlines and the noise. Subscribe now because this conversation is about to get deeper. To understand where we are, you have to go back to how this coalition was built and then how it broke. In 2025, a broad anti-Tinubu coalition formed around one goal: stop a repeat of 2023, when the opposition vote split 3 ways between Atiku, Obi, and Kwankwaso, and Tinubu won with a fraction of the total opposition tally. Atiku, Obi, former Kaduna Governor Nasir El-Rufai, former Rivers Governor Rotimi Amechi, and a long list of political heavyweights adopted the African Democratic Congress, the ADC, as their unified platform. The symbolism was deliberate. One party, one ticket, no more vote splitting. That unity didn't survive contact with the actual question every Nigerian coalition eventually has to answer: zoning. Whose turn is it? The country's unwritten rotational arrangement holds that power shifts from north to south and back. Tinubu, a southerner, is serving what many read as his one guaranteed term. That logic suggested 2027 should stay southern, at least for one more cycle, which favored Obi, a southeasterner, over Atiku, a northerner from Adamawa. That fault line didn't stay theoretical for long. On May 2nd this year, Obi resigned from the ADC. 27 days later, the newly registered NDC, the Nigeria Democratic Congress, ratified him as its presidential candidate, with Kwankwaso, the former Kano governor and Kwankwaso movement leader, as his running mate. Atiku stayed in the ADC. He entered its primary against Amechi and businessman Mohammed Hayatuddin, won it, and took Amechi as his own running mate. On July 1st, that ticket's paperwork went to INEC. 2 coalitions, 2 tickets, 1 geopolitical bloc, the North, now claimed at least rhetorically by both sides. This is where it stops being a personality story and becomes an institutional one, because Atiku's problem isn't only political, it's procedural. Under the Electoral Act 2026 and INEC's own guidelines, a party's presidential candidate has to emerge from a process the party's official leadership can certify. That's normally a formality. It has not been a formality for the ADC. Days before Atiku's nomination went to INEC, a faction of the ADC, led by a man identifying himself as the party's national chairman, Nafiu Bala Gombe, issued what it called a final warning to Atiku to stop presenting himself as the party's candidate. This faction says it has already run its own internal process and settled on a different flag bearer entirely, a little-known figure, Professor Chris Uba. Gombe's statement went further, explicitly denying that the ADC is in any coalition, merger, or alliance with any other party at all, directly contradicting the entire premise of the 2025 coalition project. This is the ambiguity that matters. INEC doesn't resolve internal party leadership disputes quickly, and Nigerian electoral history is full of cases, governorship and presidential, where the question of which faction is the real party ended up in court, sometimes right up until the eve of an election, sometimes after. If this dispute isn't resolved cleanly, Atiku's candidacy carries a standing legal vulnerability that Obi's NDC ticket, ratified without a comparable public leadership fight, currently does not. Has the ADC functioned as designed here, or has it been captured twice over, first by the 2025 coalition takeover and now contested by faction pushing back against that very takeover? That's a live institutional question, not a settled one, and it's one INEC and potentially the courts will have to answer before this ticket is secure.
Now, if what you just heard challenges what you thought you knew, drop it in the comments. I want to hear your read on this before we get to the part that reframes everything. Now, to the part that gives this story its title, and where we have to be precise about who said what. On May 12, on Arise Television, Kwankwaso gave his own account of how the NDC ticket came together. His words, that he consulted with leadership in the North to identify a capable candidate, and that the consultation placed Obi at the forefront. He described a joint political alignment between his Kwankwasia movement and Obi's obedient base, what he called the OK Alliance, as something that had already taken shape before it was ever announced publicly. That is a significant claim, and it matters. Kwankwaso is not a marginal figure. In 2015, by his own account, his mobilization delivered close to 2 million votes in the North for Buhari. A political operator with that kind of demonstrated reach, saying he consulted Northern leadership and landed on Obi, is a real data point about elite alignment. But notice what it is not. It is not a communiqué from the Northern Governors Forum. It is not a resolution from the Arewa Consultative Forum. It is one powerful Northern figure's characterization of his own consultations. And characterizations like that are exactly the kind of claim a savvy political operator has every incentive to inflate, because the North has spoken is a far more powerful message to send than I personally prefer this candidate. NID's role is to report what was said by whom and let you weigh how much of the North that one voice actually speaks for. What we can say plainly, Atiku loses a serious asset either way. Before this, Kwankwaso's political weight sat somewhere in Atiku's orbit, inside the same 2025 coalition. Now it sits explicitly against him, inside a rival ticket, framed publicly as a Northern consensus position. Whether or not that framing is accurate, it is now the framing Atiku has to spend resources contesting. Who gains from this beyond Obi and Kwankwaso? The APC does. A fractured opposition split three ways again between the ADC, the NDC, and a diminished PDP is the single scenario most likely to hand Tinubu a repeat victory, the same way 2023 did. Zoom out from the personalities, and this is fundamentally a story about whether Nigeria's unwritten zoning arrangement holds and who gets to interpret it. If the argument that the South gets one full term before power returns north carries real weight among Northern power brokers, not just Southern ones, then a Northern candidate like Atiku faces resistance from his own regional base on principle, regardless of who he is personally. That's a structural headwind, not a personal failing. For ordinary Nigerians, particularly those outside the political class, still absorbing the effects of subsidy removal, currency depreciation, and rising food and transport costs, this fight over zoning and tickets looks distant from their daily concerns. But the outcome of this fragmentation question has real stakes for them. A splintered opposition in 3 or 4 directions makes a change in economic direction less likely, not more, because it makes an APC win more likely by default, the same arithmetic that played out in 2023. There's also a security dimension worth naming honestly. A contested, litigated party leadership battle, the ADC dispute, sitting in the middle of election preparations, is exactly the kind of institutional uncertainty that can be exploited by bad actors, and exactly the kind of story that fuels distrust in the process itself, regardless of which side eventually wins in court. Briefly, because this part of the story hasn't fully crystallized yet, Nigeria's diaspora communities in the UK, US, Canada are watching this fragmentation closely, because a credible, unified opposition ticket has historically been the scenario that draws the most diaspora financial and organizing support. A 3- or 4-way split makes that kind of coordinated diaspora backing harder to mobilize behind any single candidate. Regionally, ECOWAS and international observers tend to focus less on which individual wins and more on whether Nigeria's electoral institutions, INEC chief among them, can resolve internal party disputes transparently and on schedule. The ADC leadership fight is a live test of exactly that.
Now, let's stillman the case that this is nowhere near game over for Atiku, because that case is genuinely strong. First, Atiku has been declared politically finished before, in 2007, in 2011, in 2015, in 2019, and has returned as a serious contender every cycle since 1993. Betting against his organizational persistence has been a losing bet for 3 decades. Second, the ADC's INEC filing is done. As of July 1, the Atiku Amechi ticket is officially on record with the Electoral Commission. The Gombe faction's objection is, at this stage, a public dispute, not a court ruling, and Nigerian politics has seen many rival faction claims that amounted to noise rather than a real threat to a nomination. Third, Amechi brings Rivers State and South-South networks that meaningfully complicate any simple North versus South reading of this race. Atiku's ticket is not purely a northern proposition. Fourth, and this is the honest caveat to Kwankwaso's claim, one prominent voice speaking for the North is not the same as the North actually voting as a bloc in 2027. Nigeria's North itself is not monolithic. It spans the Northeast, Northwest, and North Central, each with distinct political histories and, in past elections, distinct voting behavior. Kwankwaso speaks powerfully for a slice of the Northwest. He does not speak for all 19 northern states. The nuance being lost in the noise online is exactly this. The North picked Obi is a headline. A major northern kingmaker says he consulted northern leadership and landed on Obi is the actual verifiable claim. And the gap between those two sentences is where the real story lives. What does this mean for Nigeria's democratic trajectory? At minimum, it means the zoning question, who legitimately gets to claim it's their turn, remains unsettled and contested at the elite level, which means ordinary voters will be asked again to choose between fragmented options rather than a clarified field. 3 things to watch in the coming weeks. 1. Whether the Gombe-led ADC faction escalates from public statements to actual litigation seeking to invalidate Atiku's candidacy, or whether it fades as many rival faction disputes in Nigerian parties eventually do once INEC's recognition of the coalition-led ADC leadership becomes clear. 2. Whether Kwankwaso's OK Alliance claim translates into visible on-the-ground mobilization in Kano and the Northwest, rallies, defections of local structures, endorsements from sitting office holders, or whether it remains for now primarily a media narrative. 3. Whether any Northern Governors Forum, the Arewa Consulting Forum, or another genuinely representative Northern body issues its own position, which would be a far stronger signal than any single politician's account. If the ADC dispute resolves cleanly in Atiku's favor and Kwankwaso's alliance stays rhetorical rather than organizational, this cycle likely reverts to a familiar 3-way opposition split. Bad news for anyone hoping to unseat Tinubu, but not game over for Atiku specifically. If the ADC dispute drags into the courts and Kwankwaso demonstrably moves northern structures towards Obi, Atiku's path narrows considerably, regardless of what his INEC paperwork says. So, is it game over for Atiku? No, not on the evidence available today. What's true is narrower and more precise. Atiku's ticket is legally filed but not yet legally secure, and the Northern coalition he once anchored is now publicly, if not universally, contested by one of its most consequential figures. That is a serious structural problem. It is not a conclusion. We'll be watching whether the ADC dispute reaches a courtroom and whether Kwankwaso's alliance shows up in Kano's structures or stays a talking point. Push back on this, correct it, extend it in the comments. That's what this channel is for. What we haven't resolved yet and won't pretend to is whether the rest of the North agrees with Kwankwaso at all. That's next. If this analysis gave you clarity, not agreement, clarity, share it with one person who needs to understand what is actually happening. Like, subscribe, and I will see you in the next one.